Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a great honor and privilege to offer this paper here at the Las Casas Institute for the reasons that has just been mentioned as well. So today I would like to turn our attention to the eponymous figure of this very place, Bartolomé de las Casas, particularly the significant contribution he has made in the way that we think of modern human rights, the issue of just war, and in so doing we'll also draw comparisons from his contemporary and a no less robust proponent of human rights, albeit in a more limiting way, John Calvin. While I'm arguing that both Las Casas and Calvin were and remain significant tributaries to the way that we think about universal human rights, it must be said, and this is where I have to put my historian's hat, that the value of both these figures cannot be judged primarily and purely on the utilitarian value they bring to us in the 21st century. Were we to judge them based on the standards and accomplishments of human rights reformed since the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, I'm certain they may not measure up. But throughout this general genealogical account, I do hope that further and perhaps unfamiliar and unanticipated light can be shed in our historical constructions of the struggle towards securing the basic human rights of all people, whether religious or irreligious, racially and ethnically the same or other, and whether of the privileged and powerful class who are utterly destitute and deprived. When we normally think of the trailblazers of human rights in the West, the names of Las Casas and Calvin might not be the first ones off the tongue of contemporary scholars, and understandably so. We're more likely to think of Grotius, Pufendorf, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, and even Thomas Hobbes. To be sure, the 1789 document, most emblematic of the zeitgeist of the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, has no direct reference to deity of whatever sort. Furthermore, while this has been the way that contemporary historiography has gone about in defining and delimiting the field, I would argue this comes at a price of failing to render a more robust and better contextualized narrative. So my current research project focuses on the transformation of the way the human self has come about, basically what we will call theological anthropology in the early modern and early modern period. How is the human self to be understood vis-a-vis others and God, and the way that the self has been kind of performed, shall we say. So the two key theses of this talk are as follows. I'll spend the bulk of our time together talking about Las Casas, and less so about Calvin. In terms of my own expertise, it's actually exactly the opposite way around. I know far more about Calvin than I do about Las Casas, but a sort of an intrepid or idiotic trait I've developed over the years is that when I'm giving talks, I like to challenge myself to work on materials that I know slightly less about so that I can be more assiduous in preparing talks. So Las Casas' tireless efforts and the ideals to secure the basic rights of the Indians in the so-called New World was hammered out on the anvils of the plundering and pillaging of colonial Spain's conquistadors upon the otherwise peace-loving, non-aggressor type Indians. Although, as Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo and Juan Ginés de Sepulveda would argue, they were guilty of human sacrifice and idolatry, thus indeed of military subjugation. Similarly for Calvin, it was in the context of the religious conflicts and the resultant refugee movement in the 1520s and 1530s, which, as Heike Obermann would argue, the Reformation was a refugee movement, was a direct consequence of the Reformation in the 16th century that he began to articulate the need for securing the fundamental rights of those who would otherwise be vulnerable and nationless. This is not to suggest, however, that they were without blind spots and inconsistencies, to which I will draw our attention toward the end of the talk. In our influential book, History of Human Rights, published in 2004 and regarded by a number of reviewers as a kind of key book, the book to read if you're interested in the history of human rights from the earliest times to postmodernity, Micheline Deshay chronicled the development and trajectory of human rights from early Greek states to the contemporary age of globalization. In this tightly woven narrative, surprisingly thin is the contribution made by Las Casas and Calvin. In a more recent volume entitled Christianity and Human Rights, an Introduction, chapters dealing with historical themes cover the Judaic foundation of rights, use in Roman law, human rights in early Christianity, and human rights in the canon law. Yet, aside from the chapter from John Witte Jr. on Calvinism, the narrative makes it jump from medieval canon law to the Second Vatican Council, thereby leaving a conspicuous lacuna in the way that the story is told. Now, why such a gaping hole in contemporary historiography of human rights? Here, John Witte Jr., his illuminating comment helps us situate the contemporary context and locates this paper itself as well. So, Witte writes, human rights were the keys that Western liberals finally forced to unlock themselves from the shackles of a millennial Christian oppression and Constantinian hegemony. Human rights were the core ingredients of the new democratic constitutional experiments of the latter 17th century and forward. The only Christians who had much influence in this development, we're told, were a few early church fathers who decried pagan Roman persecution, a few brave medievalists who defied papal tyranny, and a few early modern Anabaptists who debunked Catholic and Protestant persecution. So that's how Witte argues as the reason for this sort of gaping lacuna, which I tend to agree. Louis Hankin argues that there was indeed a close connection between the political aims of Isabella and Ferdinand and the evangelization of the New World. To Spaniards of that time, there was no clear distinction between political and religious motivations. They tended to assume that political advance automatically served religion by extending religious frontiers and that religious expansion strengthened political positions. So the symbiotic relationship between politics and religion in this early modern period of expansion. And that is the context in which we locate Las Casas. So I will highlight some of the salient themes and then we'll spend our time just looking at some of the key texts and I'll commentate on that and I would appreciate your feedback on some of my own comments and glosses of these Las Casas texts. So John Major, a Scottish theologian who was heavily indebted to Aristotle's, especially his Politics, and one thing is De Sepulveda, the opponent of Las Casas in the 1550 Council in Valladolid, they both agreed that these the Indians of the so-called New World, because they were guilty of idolatry, because they were committing human sacrifices, that they were in need of being subjected to the rule of Christ at whatever cost. And so, over against that particular position, Las Casas came to realize that this is not at all following the law of Christ. So, and this is how he kind of locates the language of human rights, which is my particular interest. From their very origins, all rational creatures are born free, insomuch as in one equal nature, God has not made us slaves of one another, but has granted to all an identical freedom of choice. Therefore, one rational creature is not subordinate to another, as for example, one human being to another, seeing that freedom is a right present in human beings necessarily and per se, in virtue of the very first principle of the rational creature. Therefore, freedom is a natural right. Now, I've done this in my seminar on early modern religious history. I asked my graduate students, identify who said this. Said Locke, Hobbes, Pufendorf. Said no, it's this guy named Bartolome de las Casas. And they were incredulous. They really, no, he couldn't have said that. We don't even know who he is, and since we don't know who he is, he could not have said that. I said, no, this is that. And why? Because to have a Catholic priest or Bishop of Chiapas, the first Bishop of Chiapas in Mexico, to articulate this much earlier, 167 years before Locke and Hobbes and so on, and this is actually a remarkable thing. That freedom is a natural right. Now, the way that he does this so well, and I'm here much to learn from the Catholic colleagues here about this sort of natural law tradition, but also from scriptural studies and patristic theology, that how the human person is given, endowed by divine fiat and by the act of creation, that then freedom itself is a natural right given by God to the human creature. So there is an inextricable and inseparable connection between divine donation upon the human person and therefore the fact that the person is related to God, and that in that relation to God does one find true freedom. Las Casas made it very clear that he wrote A History of the Indies in order to free my Spanish race from error, from the serious, pernicious illusion in which it lives and has always lived until today, judging that these oceanic peoples lack the nature of human beings, considering them brute beasts, incapable of virtue and learning, corrupting the good they possess and exaggerating the evil among them. In his last will and testament, Las Casas reflected that his life's endeavor was to, quote, act against the unimaginable, unspeakable violence and evil and harm the Indians have suffered from our people, contrary to all reason, all justice, so as to restore them to the original liberty and right they are all lawlessly deprived of, and get them free of death by violence, deaths they still suffer, they perish still the same way. I have done it for almost 50 years for the sake of God alone. I have compassion at seeing the deaths of so many human beings, rational, civilized, unpretentious, gentle, and simple human beings who are most apt for accepting our holy Catholic faith and its entire moral doctrine. Human beings who have already lived according to sound principles. And I think this is where sort of an allusion to natural law here. As God is my witness, I had no other motive. This is sort of his, toward the end of his life reflections on why he so indefatigably worked toward restoring the rights of these Indians and their sovereignty as well. He called all the atrocities and plundering committed by his compatriots an egregious, quote, violation of the holy and spotless law of Jesus Christ and violation of the whole natural law. So this is the twin hinge around which his whole thesis turns. That spotless law of Jesus Christ and natural law. And so even though the Indians in the quote-unquote New World had not had the teachings of Jesus Christ yet, because they were given the natural law by God, they were, and by the act of creation itself, they were endowed with that fundamental human right. So more on this needs to be hashed out in this talk. So, most of us are quite familiar with this sort of a brief chronology of the so-called discovery of the New World, 1492 being a very important year, 1500 being the year that the Portuguese made their first landing in Brazil. But more particularly for Las Casas, he set sails to Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti or Dominican Republic, in 1502 to work for his father's estate. So he came from a sort of aristocratic background. His father was related to, by work and collaboration, to Christopher Columbus. So he comes from that sort of privileged background, trying to be a good man in a bad system, as it were. 1502, Pope Alexander VI conferred upon King Manuel of Portugal this title, quote, Lord of the Conquest, Navigation and Commerce of India, Ethiopia, Arabia, and Persia. I often wonder, what did the people of India, Ethiopia, and Arabia, and Persia think about this title? They know about this conferral that had taken place, but I don't know. And so, as a Christian myself, I must admit, this sort of expansionary program and evangelization effort is an intriguing phenomenon for me. I understand at one level, right, because politics and religion always went hand in glove, but some of the stories that are told by sincere Christians such as Las Casas, it is really significant for us to know that as a sort of episodic turn away from theistic faith for many people. It's not so much of the sort of the implausibility of Christian theology per se, as much as the sort of lifestyle and the acts of the putative followers of Christ. 1506, sorry for that aside, 1506, Las Casas leaves Hispaniola to seek ordination, gets ordained in 1507 in Rome. So 1509 comes back to the New World with a new determination to right the wrong, both personally and institutionally. In 1511, a Dominican, Anton Montesino, preaches his infamous or famous Advent sermon, speaking of the fact that he's a voice calling out in the wilderness, and if you keep on doing it this way in terms of your treatment of the natives, you will be no more entering into the kingdom of heaven than a Turk or apostate would. So a very fire and brimstone type of sermon by a Dominican. 1513, Las Casas witnessed a Canal massacre in Cuba. So about 3,000 natives who had zero intention of brutality, let alone retaliation, were massacred. And this account has been exaggerated both of the Casistas and the anti-Casistas. I mean, I think, as some of you are very well aware, the whole trajectory of Las Casas, his account has been challenged both in his contemporary period and subsequent as well. But there's a kind of a growing cadre of what they call Casistas, those who work on Las Casas, who are restoring not only the sort of significance that he has as a Catholic thinker, but also as a proponent of human rights. And I think it's a very salutary move. In 1520, as some of you know, he tried his own experiment at benign quote-unquote colonialism in Cumana, modern-day Venezuela, which sought to utilize minimum force and maximum persuasion to allow the Spaniards to live in fruitful peace with Indian peoples, turned into a failed experiment due to the greed for slaving, as he says in the party Las Casas thought would be more virtuous. He writes this thing in 1534, publishes this thing called De Unicomodo, or the only way to bring people to Christ. He was arguing for fundamental human rights of the Indians, basing this axiom on the three sources: Scripture, Church Fathers, and natural law tradition. And this becomes a very influential text. And at the heart of the only way, this text, was the portraiture of Jesus as a peace-loving savior of all humankind, who did not authorize use of force in the most dire hour of his, as he rebuked Peter's cutting the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. Central to his treatise was his conviction that the Indians were, in every way identical to the Spaniards, as he reiterates his point again and again, fully capable, rational human beings, who, in spite of their ignorance of the gospel, could never be treated in the way that they had been. Now, this is a very important point, rational creatures, because part of the argument of Sepulveda and others was that since they were not rational, look at the way they behave. In terms of their human sacrifice and their idolatry, they cannot be behaving rationally, and to the extent that they're not behaving rationally, maybe they do not even have the rational faculty. As some of you are aware, that part of this sort of imago Dei and how in the medieval scholastic tradition has talked about the constitutive element of the imago Dei was the rational faculty of the human person. It's the relational faculty, but also rational was quite key. And so, and in 1537, there was this, Paul III issues Sublimis Deus, and some of us are aware of the text. And let me allow me to read this, that is almost entirely, because it really encapsulates the sort of positioning of the church in the midst of this expansionary kind of period of the empire and Evangelion. The sublime God so loved the human race that God created humanity in such wise that God might participate not only in the good that other creatures enjoy, but endow them with capacity to attain to the inaccessible and invisible supreme good and behold it face to face. And since humanity, according to the testimony of the sacred scriptures, has been created to enjoy eternal life and happiness, which none may obtain except through faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, it is necessary that they should possess the nature and faculties enabling him to receive that faith. And that whosoever is thus endowed should be capable of receiving that same faith. Nor is it credible that anyone should possess so little understanding as to desire the faith and yet be destitute of that most necessary faculty to enable one to receive it. So according to this document by Pope Paul III, every human being is endowed with that rational ability to search after God and to find God and to receive that holy faith. Hence Christ, back to this document, said, "Go eat and teach all nations." He said all, without exception, for all are capable of receiving the doctrine of the faith. Now this is the sort of point that Calvin and Las Casas would depart, as some of you are very well aware. Calvin would say, no, every creature is compromised in the way that there is an epistemic compromise, that not every creature is able to receive that faith unless and until kind of turned on by the work of the Spirit to be able to receive it again. Whereas it seems that according to this particular text, there's a language of natural endowment that is present in all human beings. The enemy of the human race, Paul III continues, who opposes all good deeds in order to bring humanity to destruction, beholding and envying this, invented a means never before heard of, by which he might hinder the preaching of God's word of salvation to the people. he inspired his satellites, who to please him have not hesitated to publish abroad that the Indians of the West and the South, and other people of whom we have recent knowledge, should be treated as dumb brutes created for our service, pretending that they are incapable of receiving the Catholic faith. By virtue of our apostolic authority, we define and declare by these present letters, or by any translation thereof, that the said Indians and other peoples should be converted to the faith of Jesus Christ by preaching the word of God and by the examples of good and holy living. 1537. This is a papal document, and as far as that goes, in terms of the authority, it has considerable heft with people imprimatur. 13 years fast forward, you have this council at Valladolid, summoned by Emperor Charles V in 1550. According to this historian Angel Lozada, this council was unique in that it marked the first time when a nation and her king convened a gathering of theologians regarding the justice of war that was then currently waged. So it was about trying to say, okay, in the middle of a war, trying to gather a bunch of theologians and say, hey, are we doing the right thing here? Right? Whether it's a war on terror or just war, gathering a group of theologians to say, are we doing the right thing? How do we, what defines, what constitutes just war, and so forth and so on. So Charles V issued a provisional halt to the war against the Indians. Sepulveda I, Guinness de Sepulveda, was a formidable theologian, indeed with an impeccable record of being well respected and highly regarded. But he had written this text called Democrates II, the just causes of the war against the Indians, and his other text called Apologia, both of which justified, if not encouraged, the Spanish military excursions against the Indians. The former document was stoutly opposed by the universities of Alcala and Salamanca. So we'll look at this Las Casas Sepulveda showdown in this context. So one of the issues that they were trying to deal with was the issue of just war. And as a lot of the participants of this particular Las Casas Institute would be more interested in sort of issues of just war, they were trying to figure this out. Whether war should be made on the Indians to convert them to the Christian faith and under the jurisdiction of Christian monarchs. Las Casas articulated his position unequivocally, no. Most injurious breach of the law of Christ, he said, and the most egregious infraction of natural law. For Sepulveda, however, such wars were warranted, indeed necessary. Protection of the innocent, prohibition of pillaging and plundering of enemy properties. In these aspects, Las Casas was a proponent of just war, but not total war. He was arguing that, okay, he wasn't against just war theory, that's fine, but this is not a just war. You see what I mean? So in this particular instance, this was not warranted. So Sepulveda's position, among other things, let me just highlight four very quickly. Some men's natural condition is such that they are intrinsically suited for obeying and following others. In cases where they refuse to render such obedience, no recourse remains but violent subjection or subjugation. And his authority here was obvious to Aristotle, not St. Paul, and certainly not Jesus. Las Casas' rhetorical strategy was to divide up the barbarians, because Sepulveda said that these barbarians need our subjugation, into four categories. His taxonomy of barbarians included one, first, proper use of the term, cruel and inhumane person. That would be category one. Category two would be those who do not speak another language. So to the Greeks, Romans would be barbarians insofar as they don't speak our language, so there will be a lot of barbarians in our midst, depending on the sort of incommensurability of our languages. Number three, similar to number one, but more specifically, those who are incapable of governing themselves. So not only are they inhumane and cruel, but they cannot govern themselves, however that may be defined or answered. Number four, non-Christians. For Las Casas, the Indians were barbarian in the definitive category 4. Okay, that is it. For Sepulveda, however, he insisted on using category 3 as his definition of barbarians. Thus, Indians, as he leaned heavily on Aristotle, again in his politics for textual support, he continued to aver that the Indians were naturally predisposed to be slaves, as nature then was by divine design. Inasmuch as Las Casas tried to oppose Sepulveda and the Spanish plans of expansion and evangelization, he was opposing God, kicking against the goads, indeed, Sepulveda argued. So, while not denying the existence of category 3 types of barbarians, Las Casas sought to persuade Sepulveda and the council at Valladolid that the actual number of such barbarians were few and far between. More importantly, however, Las Casas parted company from Aristotle, the favorite philosopher among the late medieval scholastics, when he blasted Aristotle's opinion that these barbarians ought to be hunted down like wild beasts in order to bring them to the correct way of life. Over against the strong claim by Aristotle, Las Casas insisted that such barbarians ought to be attracted to the church by the sweet aroma of Christ, emanating from the missionary priests and even from the conquistadors themselves. So he writes, "Let us send Aristotle packing, for we have in our favor the command of Christ. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Aristotle was a great philosopher for sure, but he was unworthy of finding God through his lucubrations, unquote. So, let me just highlight a couple more things before we move on to Calvin. But as you can see here, it is in this context of the expansionary program of this empire, and along with it, how to convert them to the Christian faith, that Las Casas felt like this is absolutely against the design of Christ, to be brandishing our sword to bring them to the ruler, to the rule of Christ. And so he writes, again, if we want to be children of Christ and followers of the truth of the gospel, this is what he wrote in this text at the Council of Valladolid called In Defense of the Indians. It says, if we want to be children of Christ and followers of the truth of the gospel, we should consider that, even though these people may be completely barbaric, they are nevertheless created in God's image. They are brothers and sisters redeemed by Christ's most precious blood, no less than the wisest and most learned men in the whole world. Finally, we must consider it possible that some of them are predestined to become renowned and glorious in Christ's kingdom. Consequently, to these men and women who are wild and ignorant in their barbarism, we owe the right which is theirs, that is, brotherly kindness and Christian love. Now, did you see how he used the language of right to give this greater sense of obligation to the Spaniards? When you go and try to take your gold and so forth, don't you ever forget that you owe them something. You owe them something that is fundamentally their right. That is, since they're created in the image of God, since every creature, well endowed or small in wealth or whatever color, whatever culture, since God is the creator of all humankind, you owe them something. If you're more religiously evolved, then what you owe them is that gift that God has so graciously given to you, which you owe them most fundamentally and freely as well. So, this is, and he continues on and says this. Said, will it not stand prove that the Reverend Dr. Sepulveda has spoken wrongly and viciously against peoples like these, either out of malice or ignorance of Aristotle's teaching? From the fact that the Indians are barbarians, it does not necessarily follow that they are incapable of government and have to be ruled by others, except to be taught about the Catholic faith and to be admitted to the holy sacraments. And furthermore, he uses Aquinas' argument to say that these Indians were not subject to the church. If at all, they were only potentially so, but not actually. Therefore, pagans who have never received the faith are not voluntary and actual subjects of Christ, but potential subjects. Therefore, you cannot justify your military action as a punishment of them sanctioned by the Old Testament narrative. And so here what he does is a very interesting use of Church Father Cyprian in particular, in the way that this the story of the Canaanite conquest had been used by Sepulveda to justify what the Spaniards were doing. Many of us are aware of that particular vignette in the Old Testament. In fact, a very significant thrust of the Old Testament narrative had to do with Israel as the agent of divine justice. Right? Israel as they're conquering the land of Canaan. At least this is the way that Aristotle and, Las Casas and Sepulveda interpreted that particular story. Took it as a historical narrative, took it as something that was factual, took it as something that had happened, And more importantly, for Sepulveda, it was repeatable. Whereas for Las Casas, these were non-repeatable events. No nation could say, God sanctioned Israel to do this, so we ought to be the agents of divine justice in today's context. Right? Sepulveda argued exegetically from the Old Testament narratives that this is now our modern 16th century Spaniard kind of mission in the wilderness. Las Casas said no such conclusions can be proven from that text alone. So, fast forwarding a little bit. So then, Las Casas argues, and this is his kind of punchline in terms of giving this kind of exegetical word over against Sepulveda. Like I said, Las Casas did believe in just war. It is warranted only when, quote, a nation worships idols and after embracing the faith. So if they turn to idolatry after embracing the Christian faith, then a just war is possible. But these Indians had never embraced the Christian faith yet, therefore to call upon the name of just war is a complete nonsense. Indeed, he goes on, right? If they're warned and told to stop those impure sacrifices and their sacrilegious worship, yet refuse to repent and acknowledge the truth, then it is just to wage war against them. The Lord commanded this procedure through Moses, although the Jews were obliged to destroy the idolaters at that time, even without listening to them. And this is what he does. In this era of grace, so he is sort of a bit of a dispensationalist in a way. He says that the Old Testament era has certain goods and gracious provisions by God, but in the era of the New Testament, it says in this era of grace, however, we must think and act quite differently. By saying so, Las Casas seems to be implying that the hermeneutic of the New Testament ought to push the Christian of 16th century Spain to move beyond the cultic praxis of Israel. Now to argue from the idolaters living in the promised land to other idolaters, especially after the coming of Christ, is absurd, he writes. Otherwise, if they oblige us by the authorities of these passages, they'll also teach that the Spaniards are necessarily obliged to kill the greatest and the least of the Indians, both guilty and innocent, not accepting even draft animals, dogs, cats, as commanded in some of these passages. This is completely absurd. So, let me try to wrap things up here. So, he basically posits his theory of fundamental human rights of these Indians in particular, based on the fact that they're created in divine image. Different from the 1789 documents of the human rights language of the French Revolution. For Las Casas is fundamentally divine donation. Since God is the creator of all, God is the creator of all humankind, poor or well-to-do, white, black, everything in between. And this is what gives us that fundamental hope for treating others as you like to be treated yourself. So therefore, the Venerable Dr. Sepulveda makes a slip here, my final quote. In this consideration, he has not diligently searched the scriptures, or surely has not sufficiently understood how to apply them, because in this era of grace and mercy, he seeks to apply those rigid precepts of the old law that were given for special circumstances, and thereby he opens the way for tyrants and plunderers to cruel invasion, oppression, and spoliation, and harsh enslavement of harmless nations that have neither heard of the faith, nor known whether belief in Christian religion can be discovered, and all this under the pretext of religion. Why? He asked. So let me try to move to Calvin and bring it into a kind of a sort of a juxtaposing contrast and comparison. So here is Las Casas, a Catholic priest and a bishop, fighting tirelessly for the human rights of the Indians. And here is another contemporary, John Calvin, Frenchman, who had never set foot in Mexico or Dominican Republic, and his writings were fundamentally regarded as, I mean, when you think of John Calvin, the first word that may come to your mind would be predestination, right? Or whatever, Servetus. But human rights may not be the first thing that comes to mind, although if you visit the city of Geneva, right, this is a very interesting thing. I mean, a lot of the NGOs are headquartered in Geneva. I did a summer study when I was a graduate student in Cambridge. I spent the summer at the University of Geneva. And on Saturdays, to kind of hopefully humorous aside, we went out, my friends and I and several other people went out to have fun in the city of Geneva. That seems almost oxymoronic. Geneva is not really that much fun. You think of fun city in Europe, you think of Amsterdam, you think of Barcelona, you think of maybe Manchester or London even, right? Maybe not Oxford either, I don't know, but and so we were taking the taxi back from this pub that we were at. We drank this Calvin beer and had a good time. And so we asked this taxi driver, why is the city of Geneva so dead? And this Algerian taxi driver, without skipping a beat, says, it's because, said Monsieur Calvin. It's Mr. Calvin. That's the problem. I mean, so this North African taxi driver, about 500 years after the fact, could point his finger at Monsieur Calvin as the culprit of why the city is so dour. I mean, that seems to be sort of popular portraitures of Calvin. And I think, that may be true, as Father Richard introduced me. I edited the book, The Cambridge Companion to Puritanism, who regarded themselves as the 16th and 17th century redivivus of Calvin. And I think in some sense there is that, but in another sense, which is equally as true, is Calvin as a proponent of limited sense of human rights. I would argue that Lascaux's kind of scope of human rights is far broader, but Calvin was no less robust in the way that he articulates, at least in theory, perhaps not in praxis, but in praxis as well, in some regards, writes about the importance of human rights for those who are created in the image of God. Let me highlight a couple of passages and commentate on them, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. So for Calvin, the primary motif of the Christian life was to serve one's neighbor with a liberated conscience. Liberty and freedom was for the purpose of edification. In fact, in the third book of his Institutes, he argues that the jewel of the Christian life is self-denial. The jewel of the Christian life is not basking in the glory of predestination. It is for the express purpose of serving your neighbor. In Calvin's early writings, we see the trend of protecting the individual liberty, even for those who are excommunicated or were, as he called, Turks and Saracens. So he writes, we ought to strive by whatever means we can, whether by exhortation and teaching or by mercy and gentleness, or by our own prayers to God, that they may turn to a more virtuous life and may return to society and unity of the church. And not only are excommunicants to be so treated, but also Turks and Saracens and other enemies of religion. Far be it from us to approve those methods by which many until now have tried to force them to our faith, when they forbid them the use of fire and water and of common elements, when they deny them all offices of humanity, when they pursue them with sword and arms. This is the 1536 edition of the Institute, very first edition, when he was only 27 years old. As many of us are aware, he was born in Orléans in France, ended up in Geneva, not a city of his own, not a country of his own. He was what we would call a resident alien until 1559. So he was by then the most prominent figure, non-Genevan citizen in the city as the preacher and the pastor of St. Peter's Cathedral. And he was conferred the citizenship almost 5 years before his death. So I think he, in his commentaries on Hebrews and 1 Peter, he is very well aware of what it means to be an alien, and stranger in this world. And so I think there's a very interesting strand of Calvin's teaching that many scholars have not really discovered as much, is his keen understanding of the sense of xenophobia that could easily be kind of exploding in our midst, as we see in the 1540s. The issue of poor religious refugees became a fiercely debated and divisive issue for the Genevans, mounting of xenophobia and suspicion. So in 1545, it was a breaking point. Eviction of these refugees was very imminent. A French refugee, in Geneva, David Bouzonton, in his deathbed, bequeathed to Calvin a huge sum of money to be specifically used for founding a hospital for the French refugees. So this issue of a lot of these, Geneva being a sort of safe haven for a lot of the French-speaking kind of Protestants, Zurich being the sort of place for a lot of the Italians and also Germans. Thus was born this thing called Bourse Français. This was followed by the Italian fund, the English fund, the German fund, what we might call mutual fund societies, all designed to lend financial, emotional, and social assistance to the religious refugees. Calvin was the most generous individual donor to the ongoing work of this diaconate ministry. So he, among other things, contributed in the sort of history of Protestant theology
by seeking to renovate and rejuvenate the office of the deacon. He said this is a very important office, and he felt that the diaconate ought to be rejuvenated so that the sort of almsgiving and the poor relief could be given given as the primary task of the deacons. So, for a group supposedly known for being resigned to fatalism, it would seem that these Calvinists did a lot of work themselves towards social reform, not as an end in and of itself, but as a coaxial enterprise with the church and state. The welfare of both would redound to the lordship of God. When he drew up the ecclesiastical ordinances in 1541, he included a section on deacons. He was convinced that this renewal of the ancient church practice would revitalize the witness of the church. And it says, he really wanted the city to really get involved more in the thing of universal health care, for example. It says it would be good, not only for the poor, this is the language of the ecclesiastical ordinances of 1541, not only for the poor of the hospital, but also for those of the city who cannot help themselves, that they have a doctor and a surgeon of their own, who should still practice in the city, but meanwhile be required to have care of the hospital and to visit the other poor. Now, for all of you who live in the UK, this is no-brainer, universal health care, but as I'm living in the States, health care is not a right, it is a privilege. So many Americans do not have medical care, and in my lectures on Calvin at Vanderbilt, I often highlight the fact that as far as I can tell, Calvin would seem to fall on the side of universal health care because he sees things that by all, whether a refugee passing through or citizen, giving them the fundamental care of alleviating the ailment is something that Christians or people ought to be doing. So he suggested to the city council that the poor at the hospital be given a craft to develop professional skills, thus precipitating the arrival of silk industry at the general hospital. Now let me finish with this, what I would regard as the most beautiful passage in the Institutes in Book 3, Chapter 7, Section 6. In case one were to think that we are obliged to be nice to our neighbors who are either nice to us or are Christians, Calvin would correct our solipsistic perspectives here. In this moving section, he says, love of neighbor is not dependent upon manner of humans, but looks to God. Thus the Lord commands all human beings, without exception, to do good. Yet the great part of them are most unworthy if they are judged by their own merit. But here Scripture helps in the best way when it teaches that we're not to consider the human beings' merit of themselves, but look upon the image of God in all men and women, to which we owe all honor and love. Therefore, whatever person you meet needs your aid, you have no reason to refuse to help her or him. Say he's a stranger, but the Lord has given him a mark that ought to be familiar to you, by virtue of the fact that God forbids you to despise your own flesh. Say he is contemptible and worthless, but the Lord shows him to be one to whom God has designed to give the beauty of God's image. Say that you owe nothing for any service of his, but God, as it were, has put him in God's own place in order that you may recognize toward him the many and great benefits with which God has bound you to himself. Oh, surely there is but one way in which to achieve what is not merely difficult, but utterly against human nature. To love those who hate us, to repay the evil deeds with benefits. It is that we remember not to consider men's evil intention, but to look upon the image of God in them, which cancels and effaces their transgressions, with its beauty and dignity allures us to love and embrace them. To look upon the image of God in all human persons. So in a way, Calvin and Las Casas do not have much in common. Catholic and Protestant, in ways back in those centuries, the animosity between the two was far more sure than it is today. In another sense, they didn't have a lot in common. One spent most of his adult life in modern Central America, in Mexico, in the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. The other person spent most of his adult life as a refugee in the city of Geneva. One preached predominantly about the fundamental rights of humanity as a means of kind of recuperating the beauty of the gospel, particularly in the context of the Indian invasion. The other spoke fundamentally going through the books of the Old and the New Testament as a sort of an expository preacher, passage by passage. But where they do meet together as strange bedfellows, strange comrades, strange allies in the service of God, is the way that they begin to articulate the rights language, which is deeply anchored in the Imago Dei language. The image of God that is in every human person becomes the very kind of birthing place of both these thinkers to articulate what we regard today as the fundamental rights of all human persons. So in a very strange but, I hope, a sensible way, both these thinkers, Lascassas and Calvin, are to be treated as serious contributors to contemporary conceptions, contemporary Christian conceptions, and contemporary conceptions of the rights language that is endowed by whoever, or that is intrinsic to every human person. I suppose in the liberal tradition, that endowment is something that is intrinsic to the human person without any recourse to any kind of deity whatsoever. But in the Christian tradition, that endowment is intrinsic to the human person precisely because there is someone prevenient or prior to our being who has, by divine design, conferred it upon us. Thank you very much for listening. Yes, the floor is open for questions and comments. Yes, sir.
Well, first, thank you. I'd like to join what you said at the beginning with what you said at the end.
Yes.
Not ignoring in between.
Right.
Now, at the beginning, you mentioned the UN Declaration.
Yes.
And then you said, of course, it's a different world. And then the argument came. Now, when they were drafting the 1948 Declaration, at first God was going to be mentioned. But that had to be crossed out, because otherwise half the people wouldn't sign up.
Right, right.
Then they were going to put in nature with a big N. That had to be crossed out,
Right.
otherwise the other. So there was no grounding for human rights.
Right.
Now, all that you said, and it's convincing to me, the convergence between Las Casas and Calvin, it all turns on convincing Christian rulers and people that everyone has rights.
Right.
But what would Las Casas or Calvin say to non-Christian rulers why everybody has rights? Or did they not even think of that?
Right, I mean, so I think, particularly with Las Casas, that's where his appeal to natural law would come into play. I mean, he was utterly, clearly aware of the fact that not all had received the Christian faith, but he was clearly convinced of that putative fact, vis-a-vis the 1948 Declaration, but that everyone had by nature that law that was endowed by God in nature, so ingrained upon every human heart and conscience, some awareness of what is right and what is to be pursued. So I think he would do that. He would say, sort of like the, that Paul at Areopagus, right? The unknown God, the even worshiping, here it is. So it is almost as if Las Casas would make the argument that, well, you already know this, because God has given natural theology, natural law, natural revelation would be something that every human society and civilization would. And I think in that regard, Calvin also makes very similar argument. He calls Cicero, for example, the eminent pagan. And because in the first book of the Institutes, what Calvin is trying to do is to argue that every society, I mean, the fact that religious practices are universal is a proof that natural God has endowed it upon every human person, but over against Las Casas, Calvin would say that all of these religious practices have been misdirected because it wasn't based on Christian teaching. Las Casas is a lot less moderate than that. I think although he certainly speaks of the supremacy and uniqueness of the Christian message, because he will never walk away from the fact that all civilizations will come to their pinnacle of their human existence if and when they embrace the Christian faith. And that is precisely why he was so cross with his Spaniard compatriots, because he says, well, you make this is how it's supposed to be, that when they embrace Christianity, they will achieve the apotheosis of what they were meant to be. But the way that you go about and bring them to Christianity is utterly, diabolical. I mean, you're killing them, you're plundering them, you're pillaging them, and then you're bringing this crucified Savior to be the adopted religion of these people. I mean, so I think that's why Las Casas felt that what they were doing was utterly despicable. Because, I mean, let's say Christianity, according to your garb, I can see that you're also a Christian. I mean, we would say that Christian message is fundamentally about the love of God and the grace of God that predates us, and also will, and that, so if Christianity is about religion of love and grace, I think that's arguably the case. Then, if we go about in propagating that religion in the most violent and ruthless way, there is a real kind of missing gap, and there's some disconnect here, fundamental disconnect. And Las Casas, and so would we, would find that to be an appalling way of sharing the faith. I mean, that's why I think he begins to develop all that he does as a way of countervailing evidence of a good practice of understanding and embracing and embodying the faith. Is that
Thank you.
okay? Yes.
I may be a bit incoherent, but I read a book by Roger Rustin.
Yes.
You read it? Yeah.
Which one?
Roger Rustin, this is about rights of man,
Yes, yeah.
quite recent.
Sure.
And going back to authorities, he likes to go back to Aquinas, and Aquinas goes back to a sort of hierarchical church.
Yes.
The hierarchy of the king or the emperor or whatever
Yes.
it is.
Yes.
So, strangely, when trying to discuss rights of ordinary human rights of property,
Yes.
Rustin has to invoke bits and pieces of answers in the Summa
Mhm.
about rights of ordinary peasants to go hunting in the forest.
Yes.
Because that's where rights are. The church has got no place
Yes.
for anything
Yes.
which is down to the ordinary person, but remains incredibly hierarchical.
Yes.
And it seems to me that this problem of the law and following the law and so on
Yes.
comes upon us liberals. I'm a Christian and a liberal.
Yes.
As well,
Yes.
in that we like to invoke this authorityless 1948 convention,
Right.
which I embrace most fully.
Yes.
But it's got no power, and its power no for the people who love hierarchy.
Right.
It's got no intrinsic power.
Right.
And as the time passes,
Mhm.
when the horror of war is forgotten,
Mm.
it loses more and more power.
Mm.
What's your answer to that? It's incoherent.
I would.
Explain
Well, I mean,
it's
maybe
around
not an
us.
answer, but just allow amen to what you've said in one sense.
Good.
Well, when you talked about peasants hunting, this came to mind. So during the Peasants' War in the Reformation period, a lot of the Anabaptists, for example, were one of their fundamental opposition to to these rulers and lords and aristocrats was that, who has the proprietary right of these streams? Why should I pay you? This whole issue of going into the forest and to hunt. Well, I mean, the public. How do you define the emergence of public sphere, right? I mean, how do you define if it is a public land? Can I not do it myself? And so that the language of proprietary rights becomes a very hotly debated issue in the Anabaptist Reformation period as well. Very much so, because they I forgot the exact title of that particular document, and I should know because I teach it every year. But it's about the Peasants' War, and one of the 11 premises or theses, 2 of them had to do with proprietary rights and how they were deprived of their right to be fishing and hunting fowl and so forth because these lords and landlords and so on are most brutal in the way that they're depriving of these people of their fundamental rights and livelihood. So economic and human rights were. So I think, but to go back to, because I think there's a sense in which I wasn't able to follow what you were articulating, and that is, are you saying that in the Thomistic tradition there is a kind of a preponderant emphasis on hierarchy?
Yes.
Therefore, it doesn't all. So when we talk about rights, it's not equal rights. It's unequal distribution of rights, but everyone has some kind of right.
I think what I'm saying
Yes.
is that the way that the church
Yes.
operates
Yes.
is that we tend to lean on authority and authoritarian statements.
Yes.
And we still haven't found a language.
Yes.
Las Casas has got a language, but it goes back to image, man made in the image of God.
That's right.
Which is very strong for me, but it doesn't seem to be strong somehow in the tradition of the church. You're not an expert on the tradition of the church, I know.
No, I'm not. I just know the 1640s through 1690s in England. So I beg your pardon on that.
I think you've done enough.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you very
you.
much.
Yes, hi. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much indeed. That was a fascinating discussion. Could I ask you about the substance of the rights?
Yes.
So you concentrated, fascinatingly, on the development of individuals as right holders.
Yes.
And I'm interested in what the rights were conceptualized as being. So
Yes.
what's the substance?
Yes.
And I mean, it struck me in the beginning of the, I'm concentrating now on Las Casas.
Yes.
In the beginning of the talk, the substantive right that seemed to be in play was equality. In
Yes.
other words, the notion that the Indians,
Yes.
or the Aboriginals, should be treated
Yes.
in the same way as those who were the direct subjects of the
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
But as the discussion went on, there seemed to be something slightly different going on,
Yes.
which was whether the Indians were in some way the holders of rights, but potentially either more or less rights than the Spanish themselves had.
Right.
So in one sense, if I could just finish,
Yes.
in one sense, the notion of the Indians as autonomous, as to be kept separate and not to be imposed upon,
Yes.
seems to be treating them as different. So I'm wondering whether there's a tension here, which maybe is a modern tension that didn't attract Las Casas' attention,
Yes.
but are we treating them as equal, the same, or are we treating them as different? So what's the substance of the rights
Yes.
that are in play here?
That's an excellent question and point, I think. So let me try to unpack this. And I've been thinking a little bit about this actually. It's a sort of a double entendre in a way. It says, on the one hand, they're given this fundamental equal rights by the fact that God has created them all. At the same time, it's not a sort of a good postmodern religious world, is it? I mean, there seems to be a bit of he seems to regard Christianity both as a privilege and an obligation. Privilege in that you have it. Las Casas makes no bones about the fact that Christianity is sort of at the highest echelon in terms of revelations of God. But at the same time, he grounds it as a sort of an obligation. Remember that passage that these Indians have right. They by right can demand that you show them the correct pathway to Jesus Christ. So I think there's a kind of position of privilege and obligation that is mutually co-present in the sort of a missionary priest or conquistador. You know, whether you're going for mercantile purposes or state purposes or for the purpose of emissary of the church, you are supposed to be embodying the spirit and the zeitgeist of the gospel. So I think in one sense there's a fundamental equal rights, but I do think that, and I think this is some area that needs further work, because I think my temptation, to be honest, is to say that, oh, he had no such kind of, he was just so, because, I mean, as a 21st century scholar, especially, and I don't know if this is my ultimate authorial intent, to make Las Casas and Calvin more palatable to my secular colleagues and say, oh, they didn't believe in any of this. No, but then I'm not being true to my training as a historian. I think, so as a historian, I must look at what Las Casas did, and I think there is a sense in which he regarded, even though there's a kind of co-presence of obligation and privilege language, but the fact that, look, fundamentally he would regard them as barbarian. And he doesn't deny it. He says, well, they are barbarian. And he got into a lot of trouble with the fact that he was so kind of squeamish about calling child sacrifice. So a lot of the Spanish kind of theologians were saying, look, you are so, in contemporary, so liberal, so far out, because you're most embracing and protective of these Indian rights and their sanctity of life, that they're kind of merciless killing of their own babes. You don't even see that as a horrid kind of, sin against nature. So, so the part I didn't get into a lot, which will show up in the book, is that the language of sin against nature shows up as a real kind of a weapon against Las Casas. But I think you're right, that there is a sense in which he is regarding, on the one hand, equal, the Imago Dei is given equal to all, given to all equally. But what people have done with us, so the donation is that God has given to all, yes, but what have they done with the Imago Dei within them, and further cultivation and development of it? The same language shows up in Calvin as well as Las Casas. I think that's where the differential kind of shows up, right? In that Las Casas would argue Christians, when doing right and being right, are more developed in terms of cultivating the Imago Dei within than those who have not received the faith. And I think he argues along, but he's really kind of walking this very tightrope walk, right? Because he doesn't want to argue that they are basically Christians on Christians unawares. It's not the sort of Ron Arian kind of maxim that he's not doing that. But he doesn't want to say that they're so far away from the truth, and so he calls them again unequivocally barbarians, because he has to use the taxonomy that Sepulveda is using in order to do some kind of theological rhetorical jiu-jitsu. He wants to take the term and say they're not actually the sort of barbarians that you think they are. They are barbarians insofar as not being Christians yet. But I think I've written this down as a further food for thought. I think you're really right on about that, and I think that needs to be more teased out in the actual writing. Thank you. Yes, Derek, Robert? Yeah.
Thank you again. You have a further question about rights. I suppose when I think of a human right now, I might think of it as something that one I possess and that I can claim as a human being against another person, whether or not there's a political authority kind of in place to enforce that right. Do you have a sense of what Las Casas or Calvin would have thought of when they said right? What would it have meant? What we might think of it as?
Yes.
And is it? I suppose I'm also curious. Is it a new thing that they're doing in making these?
No, I mean within the sort of Christian tradition and more Judeo-Christian and perhaps even Islamic tradition as well, the language of right, it seems to me, both. Let me limit it to Judeo and Christian, so the Old Testament and the New Testament, and subsequent commentating traditions. Rights language almost always entails obligation. It's the neighborly. So in the language of grace, then you are free, so that you can. This is the language of St. Paul, right? you are free, so that you can be a servant of all. So it's that rights that and Christ says, and you, if you hold to my teachings, you are truly my disciples, and then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So there's a language of discipleship, which means for some post-liberal contemporaries, liberals, discipleship, the slave of Christ, that's a horrid language. That means I'm depriving myself of selfhood and freedom. It seems that at the core of the Christian message is that is to me what is really countercultural. That to be really free, you need to belong to Christ. In your belonging to Christ, you truly find freedom. This is, in the Johannine tradition as well as Paul. And so it seems that subsequent commentators rightfully picked that up, both the Pauline and Jesus tradition, and said rights obligates us to do something, right? So I think that to me is a major differential. I think contemporary, in the contemporary kind of political theories also pick up on this as well. That we cannot, can you imagine let's say this is the human society as we know it, and all of us claim our rights, and that's all we do. Then that will be a terrible society to live in, right? Because I am always clamoring for me, myself, and I. But I don't see myself in any way obliged to be nice to you or nice to you because I'm just fighting for my own right to party. And that just wouldn't do. And I think this is where I think a lot of this kind of post-secular context of ours, a lot of the sort of thinkers, that the rebirth or renaissance of the language of rights as obligation, I think is really kind of right. And I don't know of many thinkers who, maybe Oliver O'Donovan has talked about some of this as well, but I think that is a very kind of fruitful area of discourse. And again, I'm an early modern historian, but I will, just as a personal anecdote, the way that I've been interested in this is more autobiographical. My father was a political prisoner in South Korea, and during the Park regime in the mid to late 1970s. So as a small child, from primary school year 3 to year 6, I didn't see my father. And I wasn't religious until I was 21, but so the sort of fundamental rights of my dad as a dissident. And so I've just received tenure at Randall, so I can now research on whatever I want to research on. This is one of the first post-tenure projects. It's something that's been really kind of near and dear to my heart. And especially as a historian of early modern England, early modern Europe, how this language of rights and language of human self, and how the and I'm interested in the sort of early Enlightenment period, how does emancipation of, man came about, at what cost? Was there a cost? So inevitably I impinge on contemporary debates as well, because I think in our post-secular, maybe we're so secular, it depends on who you talk to, but if you talk. So I think in this context, these questions are really coming back to us with great ferocity and potential fruitfulness. So. Yes?
Even though many of the colonizers, the
Yes.
Spanish, the Portuguese,
Yes.
the Dutch, the British in South Africa, might have been Christian, is it not the case that they did not have the spiritual and intellectual equipment
Right.
to see the indigenous peoples of these countries
Yeah.
as neighbors?
Right.
Love your neighbor as yourself
Yes.
inspires ideas of equality and
Yes.
reciprocity.
Right.
However, they were dealing with people who they were subjugating,
Yes.
who were enslaved, who were pushed off their land,
Sure.
who didn't have their education or their guns or their power.
Yes.
And it was only until such time,
Yes.
particularly in South Africa,
Yes.
where I come from,
Uh-huh.
when the subjugated peoples
Yes.
gained power,
Yes.
either through trade unions
Right.
or
Right.
international
Sure.
support, through
Sure.
sanctions,
Sure.
or the UN,
Mm.
when the boot's on the other foot, when they can actually
Mm.
bargain themselves into a position
Yes.
where they say to the oppressors,
Yes.
you're no longer in charge, you
Right.
have to treat us as equals.
Right. Right.
You have this problem of power and subjugation
Absolutely you do. Yes.
in this awful history of
Sure.
subjugation.
Yes. You're absolutely right. I mean, one can think of the obvious fact that Las Casas was part of the empowered elite, right? He wasn't a native. He wasn't an Indian, right? He was part of the Spanish ruling elite. Having the courage to fight the power, as it were, while perhaps being in the position of power. You can, think of Martin Luther King Jr., right? Along with Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu and numerous others, fighting for the fundamental rights. Gandhi would be another prime example. I mean, closer to the Dutch context. You may recall this this episode at the Synod of Dort, where the Arminians and Calvinists were duking it out over predestination. One of the issues that really came to the fore was whether or not to baptize the slaves. Now, why would that be a problem? Now think about the language and the rite of baptism. What does it make you? If you're baptized, this person is is simultaneously a servant, but also a brother or sister of yours. So there was a whole debate as to whether we should baptize them or not. We should catechize them with baptism. So to their credit, they took the power and the efficacy of baptism very seriously. If you baptize them, something happens to them, in that they are now truly in the family of God. Right? The fraternal bond that is created through the blood of Jesus is thicker than the blood that that she and I may not share, because I'm a Dutch person and this person is an African servant of mine. So I do think that there's this kind of the Christian struggle to really take seriously the extraordinary demand that the Christian gospel made upon them. I mean, many of us, certainly I would be the first person to admit that I fall daily, if not hourly, short of the gospel kind of standard. So I think, when looked upon as kind of macroscopically, it seems that the followers of Christ have had several kind of highlights, but a lot of us were just, pedestrians in the way that we don't always do well in terms of taking that language of rights and obligations seriously. Or in South Africa, we can multiply context upon context, where Christians who, and I think you're right, so having said that many of these soldiers and conquistadors may not have known much about, how do I actually see this person as a brother or a brother? Well, then I think greater onus will be upon the clergy. The missionary priests and pastors, don't they know? And so I think it is, and that study, for example, the history of Christian mission, which is sort of poo-pooed upon these days, I think it's a very important kind of area of further inquiry to see, and there's been some recent work done on this theme of colonialism and missionary enterprise and post-colonial kind of backlash and how to reconceptualize or reconceive of Christian missions, both Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and so on. But I think, you're right. We haven't always measured up, and not just the soldiers themselves, but those who ought to have known better have not always followed suit. So, thank you.
I think we have to call a halt to the formal questions there. In a moment, I'd like to invite you to join us for a glass of wine or a glass of fruit juice in the cloister. But just before we do that, to thank Professor Lim very much indeed for an extremely valuable, insightful and constructive talk, where it has been good to find common ground and to be reminded of the degree to which the theological dimension of the thinking of these two great theologians is important in the foundational history of human rights discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you.